Thanks for joining us today. And I saw a lot of familiar names and many unfamiliar names there in the chat room. So good to see you. Um, I'm going to open with the business of reframing tourism and why we need to do that. And apologies to a few of you who have seen the beginning of this before, but most of you haven't. So do bear with me. But as Sam summed up, we 6 organizations have come together to avoid the not so great side of tourism and do everything we can to encourage the good side of tourism. And this is a golden opportunity right now as we begin to come out of what we could call the coronavirus hiatus. So some quick definitions, and there are many different ways to define this, but a couple of the shorter ones. What is a destination? It's simply a place where tourism is occurring. Region, city, island, town, or neighborhood. Usually there's a place for visitors to stay. In most cases, we would not consider a single private property a destination. There needs to be some kind of community. And what is destination stewardship? That's the process of caring for the place. And that includes its natural and cultural heritage of distinctive universal value too. And this you can sum up as saying maintaining integrity of place, keeping a place distinctive and interesting, which is good for tourism and great for the people who live there. So let's look at reframing tourism perceptions. And this is something that has really become impressed upon me in the past couple of years. Tourism is not like other industries, but policymakers, governments, and so on tend to speak of it as if it were. It sells a product that it neither owns nor manufactures. That's the place, the destination. And tourism companies facilitate the encounter between the visitor and the destination, the place and its people. That's the real picture of the whole ecosystem, if you will, the tourism ecosystem. Now, I've long pointed out that there's 3 different styles of overlapping tourism, and each one has a different relationship to place. And these become even more important as we come out of that corona hiatus. The first style is the origin of the word, to tour, and it involves all the activities you see here, and it relies on both the human and physical character of the place, including its natural history and so on. Whether you're hiking in Machu Picchu in summer or Scotland in winter, this is a touring style activity. And it has the characteristic of spreading tourism benefits and impacts throughout a destination, and it can support small businesses, but it does need to have the distinctive character that makes a place interesting to visit. The next style, rest and recreation tourism, really only needs the physical character. It needs the beaches, the lakes, the mountainsides for ski slopes, but the human side is purely optional. And it has these characteristics: a tendency to sprawl, and that brings on broader environmental impacts. But it also provides an opportunity to bring the tourism story into these resorts in all the different ways you see here. The third one is really a different kind of business: manufactured attractions that don't depend on character of place at all. And they involve these activities you see here. And the important thing about them is that they change the nature of the locale. They can have high impact. They're high employment generators. They invite mass tourism and high traffic. And since they have no connection in particular to the place where they are located, you can do this kind of tourism anywhere. You can do it in the middle of a desert. And a well-known example is in the middle of a desert, which is a fairly good place for it. Where you don't want this is in a place that is special in some other way, because this type of tourism can easily spoil it. And that's exactly what tends to happen when there is no management of how tourism works. There's a tendency from the destination point of view, if the touring style is how people discovered in the first place, then it will transition to R&R and then eventually into entertainment. And it happens that way because someone says, hey, look at all those tourists there on the beach, like a casino. And before you know it, the unspoiled destination has turned into something spoiled. Now, one other important thing to point out here is that of these three styles, entertainment, manufactured attractions is the only one we can make more of. It really needs to be treated as a separate kind of industry from place-based touring and R&R style. And we'll see how that kicks in as we explore this a little more. And this is the basis for that first principle of the coalition, which is it's important to see the whole picture, recognize that tourism involves all these different aspects of a destination, not just the industry businesses, but lots of other businesses that are related to it, ecosystems, nature, culture, communities, aesthetics, the whole thing. So reframing tourism's success is now our next challenge. Customary metrics for measuring success are not necessarily the ones that work very well. More is not always better with tourism. Consider a company. What's the conventional way to measure its success? How much money does it make? An industry. How much money do all the companies make? An economy. How much do the industries contribute to GDP? But if success is measured as if tourism were like any other industry, then distortions can occur. And we've seen those quite a bit in recent decades. Over-tourism, overdevelopment, loss of character, environmental and cultural stress, and so on. Most of you are familiar with this. So the first error from a policy-making point of view is the tendency to define success by counting transactions alone. That's what goes into GDP. We need to take a deeper dive into how the money works. Who gets it? How much stays in the destination? How well is it distributed? And there's also hidden burdens like sanitation, for instance, in heavily touristed places. And sometimes there are hidden benefits. There are sometimes businesses that don't realize they're getting some of the business from tourism until that tourism goes away. They know it now. So this brings us to the economics of quality versus quantity. And just to look at a theoretical example, if you've got 10,000 tourists spending $10 a day in a destination, you've got $100,000 coming through. How would that happen? Picture 5 big cruise ships. If you've got 500 tourists spending 200 a day, you also have 100,000, maybe in medium-sized hotels. But the impact is enormously different. Here's a real life example, thanks to our colleagues at CREST. The study was done some time ago of cruise versus stayover tourists in Belize. And when you look at the numbers, you discover that the stayover tourists, 1/3 the number of the cruise ship tourists, provide 5 times as much economic benefit for a total difference of over 15 times advantage. And this sort of study has now been verified in several other islands and several other locations around the world to varying extents, but some of them are more striking than this one even. The second error that policymakers tend to make is measuring by headcount alone. That's how ministries of tourism love to do it. You know, we're going to get 20 million more tourists this year. Won't that be great? But you can't cram an infinitely growing number of tourists into a limited space. And if you don't believe that, look at the 200 or so tourists that try to look at the Mona Lisa every year, where once there might have been only 5 back in the 50s. So if you go by head count alone, you run the risk of damaging the reputation of the destination. You create an opportunity cost because people that might want to stay over don't want to go there. And an encouragement of going by arrivals alone encourages crowding, and it disregards economic leakage, environmental stresses, and so on. So these are 2 great things not to do, or certainly not to do alone. It's okay to use them as partial measures. So let's look at another real example from a few years ago, and this is where the disconnect begins to occur. Ireland's Cliffs of Moher, if you haven't been there, they're on the west coast of Ireland, and they are very cliffy, and they're popular. And what was happening was they were getting a little too popular. So the managers of the place wanted to add a higher parking fee for these tourist buses, coaches that were bringing in lots of people, and try to discourage the number of people that were visiting at one time. But they were somewhat blocked at that time by County Clare. The government wanted more tourists. Arrivals is what they were looking for. The good news is they have kind of sorted this out nicely and now have incentives for stay over tourism and disincentives for day trippers. But this is a very common situation all over the world. At the same time this was happening, on the opposite side of the world, it was happening in Tasmania, where the managers of a park were asking for controls on how many people could visit at one time. And the premier of the state was saying, no, no, we've got to have more tourists. It's good for business. Well, it is until it begins to sour. So this is the problem. If we see tourism industry as simply the sum total of business transactions, the contribution to gross national product, we have a problem. And none other than the originator of the idea of gross national product, Simon Kuznets, who won the Nobel for it in the 1930s, would disagree. And he disagreed at the time. He said, look out, don't rely entirely on this measurement. And he wasn't even talking about tourism, just in general. And nevertheless, governments have seized onto it as the one and only great measure of success. So let's look at what's happened here. We'll take a look at the cliffs from two different perspectives. And I call this the Kuznets gap in between. On the left here, we have the tourism industry. And this is pretty much the transaction-driven activities or things like infrastructure that are being developed to increase numbers of transactions. And that's seen by many as the sum total of the tourism industry. On the other hand, we have the stewardship-driven people, and these involve various NGOs that support different aspects of a destination, and also quite a few tourism businesses, many of whom I see are listening today. And you know what's going on because you're taking your clients to see what a destination is all about. And if it is harmed, that is not good for your business. These two sides don't talk to each other enough. In many cases, if not most, they don't talk to each other at all. We need to fix that. So here's the key lesson from all of this, and that's recognizing the reality of tourism impacts and implications as the prerequisite to collaboration on good destination stewardship. And that begins with real tourism management. And the first challenge there is to actually manage it. And that is not commonly done. And we have heard often from over-touristed places, the frequent complaint, no one's in charge. Excuse me. And we need to have someone in charge so that these things don't happen. So first step is agree, yeah, it needs management. And luckily, this is beginning to percolate through as more and more DMOs are changing what that M stands for, from marketing to management. But DMOs can't do this alone, even if they need to be properly reconstituted for first, but they can lead the way. But it takes a broader collaboration. So manage holistically, with full regard to the destination's character and assets. And let's take a quick look at what those assets are. What makes a place special? And when I say assets, that's a cold term. This is what makes you love a place. All these different things that you can experience when you're visiting a destination. And this includes many small and medium-sized businesses that you may encounter when you're traveling. And one of the worst, I think, victims of the coronavirus hiatus has been these businesses, places like this artist studio, bookshops and whatnot that aren't necessarily even considered tourism industry. they're part of the pleasure of visiting a place and they're part of the pleasure of living in a place. So destinations are a holistic product. A holistic product requires holistic management. Oh, and by the way, people live there. And so we need to bring everybody on board and manage with full engagement. All the stakeholders really means just about everybody. To plan holistically, we need people representing all these different features of a place at the table. I won't read this whole list, but it's reflective of the pictures that I just saw. You get the idea. And also what I call the forgotten stakeholders. The community residents, they're the destination hosts, whether they like it or not. The tourists, the destination guests, some of whom are quite clueless. And the no-shows. This is an interesting group. Tourists that you might want to have, but who don't come. They have some mistaken perception of what the destination is all about or what conditions are there. These people also need to be brought into the process. So last part of this, no, second to last, is manage sustainably, care for the place and the planet. I think most people here are familiar with the need to care for the planet, but don't forget to care for the place as well. And this is all important when we talk about sustainability. We've heard more than once people, again, policymakers saying, okay, sustainability is great, but we've got to survive after this pandemic crisis, and we'll get back to sustainability. This is the same thing. Sustainability is survival. And from the monetary point of view, it pays to sustain nature in a destination. It can reassure clients, it attracts beneficial tourists, and it enhances destination appeal. Same thing for culture, art, dance, music, artisanry, all can attract beneficial tourists and enhance destination appeal. And most important, those tourists are beneficial because they help these things stay alive. Often they can't survive on local attendance alone. Historic preservation, same thing. It pays to sustain that. Build pride and cultural heritage, attract beneficial tourists, enhance destination appeal. And there's a human story to all these places. These people helped build this church in the Azores. It's a story to tell, and that's what makes tourism entertaining. And of course, it pays for local people to benefit. That's the core of the virtuous circle. If tourism focuses on the unique heritage and assets of a place, if the community benefits from tourism drawn to those assets, if those benefits motivate the community to care for the quality of the place, then a virtuous circle is created. This looks very simple. It's not that easy. Lots of things endanger each one of those arrows. And that's why, again, it's important to have collaborative management to make sure this kind of relationship works. And last thing on this is manage for the long term, destination resiliency. And this, of course, has been a big lesson after both the coronavirus hiatus and numerous weather events we've had connected to climate change. Excuse me. So we want to future-proof the destinations. One thing is diversify the economy. And all tourism destination is vulnerable and boring. If everybody's leaving the farms to go work in the restaurants, that destination has a problem. And that's happened in quite a few places. Diversify tourism sources. You've probably learned this lesson in the past year, but having domestic tourists, young educated backpackers who are fairly tough and are willing to go places, same for adventure tourists, and any visitors who care about the place. These groups are the most likely to be undeterred by some international crisis. They're your most resilient customers. I believe we need a resiliency bank to help those distinctive local businesses and their employees survive disasters like this. And what tends to happen is that the big boys get the government assistance and the little ones are overlooked. And yet it's the little ones that are interesting from a tourism point of view and add to the quality of life in a destination. And last, we need to be able to cope with long-term issues better than we have been. Climate change, the next pandemic, and there will be one sooner than the last, and ensure that we've got collaborative destination management that can survive changes in government. So to take action, we begin convening a Destination Stewardship Council equivalent. That's the first thing to do, and Crest is going to talk a lot more about this, but I'll introduce the idea here with GSTC's criterion A1. This is the Global Sustainable Tourism Council. That's the closest thing we've got to an international agreement on what sustainable tourism is. And note the description: an effective organization, department, group, or committee. We're not being too prescriptive here, just that it's something that can do a coordinated approach to sustainable tourism with involvement by these different sectors. And in effect, that's a Destination Stewardship Council by whatever name. And now is the time. There's Corona Recovery Task Forces out there, and that can perhaps they can spread their arms and turn themselves in to the Stewardship Council steering group. One thing we've recommended from our experience doing this back at National Geographic was to adopt a tripartite multi-sector approach. You saw a diagram for that with Sam's introduction, and here it is again. And here's how it can actually work in practice, is that you've got the steering group, which is really the core group that makes things happen, and then various programs that can bring in experts and project leaders and residents and tourists themselves to do various things. And then there's also the matter of a tourism management plan. And again, Crest will get into this some more, but I want to point out that a plan itself can be a catalytic event to help bring together a stewardship council, provided that the community is involved. That's essential. So I'll end with this quote from a year ago in the Wall Street Journal, that beacon of sustainability, when Sam Walker wrote this: "When the great restart begins, that's now, many leaders will fall back on an idea once espoused by Machiavelli, who said the great majority of mankind are satisfied with appearances as though they were realities." And Sam went on to say they'll try to reduce the anxiety in the air by restoring familiar routines, procedures, and traditions. The problem is that business as we knew it cannot be recovered. It will need to be reinvented. And that's why, again, sustainability does not mean just going back to the way it was before. It has to be woven in to our new world of tourism. So reinventing tourism, the first prerequisite is to close that perception gap and see tourism as it really is. The ultimate tourism product is the place itself. Tourism businesses facilitate and add value, but they depend on it. And therefore, managing tourism and managing the place are parts of the same job. That requires collaboration among the resident community, the destination marketers, industry, government, NGOs, researchers and scientists, and the travelers themselves. And with that, I'll now turn things over to my colleagues at Crest, and Ellen Rue is going to take a deeper look into how you can get a stewardship council